I'm Dee Martin, and along with Scott Segal, I head PRG, which is the Government Relations and Strategic Communications practice here at Bracewell. Our team is all here live in Washington, D.C., a bit bleary-eyed, but excited to share with you our take on the 2024 elections. Today, you're going to hear from Scott Segal, who is, and I quote, one of the most sought-after names in environmental policy with the expertise that few can match, according to The Hill. You'll also hear from our senior political strategist, Liam Donovan, who Politico called a keen, clear-eyed analyst of legislative maneuvering. If you want to know more about IRA implementation and the tax Super Bowl, and I know that many of you do, what's going to happen in this new political climate, then don't miss our head of energy tax policy, Tim Urban. Joining us on media, Frank Maisano, the man E&E News dubbed the king of energy flax, will be with us today. On what we might see from an oversight perspective, we're going to hear from Joe Brazauskas, former senior EPA official and House Oversight Committee counsel. And what can you expect in the trade and tariff space, an issue that I know is near and dear to many of your hearts. Trade policy experts Josh Zive and Paul Nathanson, the head of our strategic communications practice, is going to tell you that. We're also thrilled to announce that you're going to hear from some very special guests. Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski, a visionary Democrat representing Illinois 13. The Honorable Mark Menzies, President and CEO of the United States Energy Association and former Department of Energy Deputy Secretary. Donovan Martin is here, Politico's Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist. And from E&E News, we have Ben Starrow, who covers energy transitions. Folks, this is going to be a jam-packed session full of a lot of great information. You know the drill. Submit your questions in the Q&A feature. Don't use chat. That's been disabled. And we'll either answer your questions as we go or we're going to catch them at the end. This is being recorded. The recording will be posted online and it will be emailed to you. One final important note before we launch. A huge thank you to Caitlin Sickles, Senior Principal here in PRG, for producing this amazing show, and to our incredible AV and marketing teams for their hard work in making it a success. So we're going to start with Scott and Liam. Scott, I'm going to go over to you. Tell us what just happened.
All right. Thanks so much, Dee. Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say for the good of the order here is we totally nailed this. We had it completely predicted down to the last vote. And as many of we've visited with many of you that are online on what we thought was going to happen. And I will say, yes, the red ripple that perhaps we anticipated was a little bit more tideworthy than perhaps we expected it at first go. But we do want to dive into the details a little bit here. So, Liam, I'm going to start with you. As soon as Jonathan joins us, we'll add him to the floor here and have him review some of these questions too. Liam, you are one of the top political factotums that I interact with on a daily basis, and with significant followers on both X and on Substack and frequent media appearances on television, the major networks, CNN, Fox, etc. So, overarching question. I mean, as I sat back and observed things last night, it almost seems like there's been a weird Freaky Friday role reversal for the Republican and Democratic parties of yesteryear. Parties now seem to be divided a lot more along class and socioeconomic lines, which is sort of what I seem to recall Bernie Sanders saying. So it is interesting to see that playbook deployed by the modern sort of populist Republican Party, and less along the traditional kind of big tent sort of ethnic and racial lines that we've seen constituting the Democratic base in years past. Discuss that, but also what are the other big takeaways? I love to hear myself talk, so I'm just going to assume that's one of the takeaways. But what are some of the other big takeaways that we learned from last night?
Well, just to pick up on your point, Scott, I think the irony here is the working class realignment, the racially depolarized, diverse coalition that Republicans have been looking to put together really since the tail end of the Bush era has arrived, and it simply does not look like and didn't take the form of what anyone expected. If you think back to the autopsy of 2012 and the prescriptions that were laid out, they basically shredded that and went a completely different direction. And guess what? It came anyway. This is a testament to really the singular persona and appeal of Donald Trump, such as it is, the cultural dynamics that have taken over throughout the country. I think you can draw whatever lesson you'd like. You can zoom in on any demographic and say this was about, young men. This was about, Black and Hispanic voters, choosing the Republican Party. It really was a bigger macro trend, a shift in almost every county across the country toward Republicans. The only question is how big that was. And quite frankly, it was the blue states where you had the big, massive moves. The swing states, there were smaller moves, but enough to put Donald Trump in a position he's never been in. Not only as the victor in the Electoral College, but as the fairly overwhelming victor in the popular vote, coming relatively close in blue states in New Jersey and Illinois, states like that. It is not what anyone expected. Even though the polls sort of pointed in this direction as a possibility, it's a reminder of the humility that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about these things.
That's great. Hey, listen, so it's 2:45 in the morning. I guess, technically speaking, this morning, and Donald Trump has been weighing in for a period of time. In fact, it was not quite one of his rally stem winders, but it was a lengthy speech given the lateness of the hour. And, one of the things I noted around the 2:45 to 2:48 mark is what I heard to be a more conciliatory tone in the Trump speech last night. He didn't quite call for Democrats and Republicans to do a kumbaya together, but he did use phrases like help our country heal, and success in bringing the country together as one of the teachings of what was going on here. All right. So I wonder, how does Trump handle a restored term? He obviously is, in a sense, a lame duck in the sense that he can't stand for re-election in 4 years. So does that mean he's more open to running with the populist football, or does that mean he is more likely to perhaps be conciliatory, like that speech sort of seemed? What do you think? And I see Jonathan Martin is on. If we can get him up on the stage, that would be great.
And I want to hear Jonathan's answer to this, because this is actually it's the sequel to This Shall Not Pass. But I think this is a very familiar setting that we're in, not unlike November of 2016, where all things were possible. The magnanimous Trump could come out, who could, transcend the political divide and heal the wounds and unite the country. Should we expect that? I don't know that I would. There's an element of the revenge tour that's probably inevitable here, but we'll have to see. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about probably throughout this day is that personnel is policy, and it's not just about what Donald Trump wants to do and what he intends to do. It's what the people around him intend to do, who are in the key positions, what is their agenda, and how does that play out, both on both ends of Capitol Hill, or both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, rather.
Well, that personnel is policy question, we will dive deeper into that. But it is true that nothing helps more than winning the Senate back in having the ability to do confirmation of your range of candidates for office. So that'll be interesting to see how that folds out. So this president, en route to this, as we can only call it, a restoration, faced a lot of issues. Obviously there was the matters of January 6th. There was overcoming indictments, pending enforcement actions, impeachments, etc. Liam or Jonathan, if you can hear us, it's like, okay, let's see. Like, click on that. No, I don't know. Jonathan, can you hear us? It's like a Ouija board.
Let's see.
If you can hear us, looks like you're muted.
Can we?
Okay, I'm gonna ask the question. I'm gonna let you proceed, Liam. Could anybody but Trump have overcome that kind of, that kind of hole that he started out in?
I got you. I'm here.
Awesome. Okay, Martin, here you go. Scott Segal here. The question is, could anybody?
I've had you up for 10 minutes, man. I got you. Go ahead. Hit me.
Okay. Okay, good.
Jesus fucking Christ. Go ahead.
All right. Could anybody but Trump have overcome what he overcame last night? And did you detect more of a conciliatory tone as he was doing his victory lap last night about 2 in the morning? Okay.
No.
All right.
No, there's no new Trump.
Okay.
There's no new Trump. I mean, people have been trying to make this guy something he's not for 9 years. He is what he is, and apparently the country's fine with that. I mean, that's kind of the reveal here, right? I mean, Americans are like, I paid less for gas under that guy. The end, right? And it's not that complicated. And the Democrats try to fix their challenges by doing, character and identity stuff, which can get you some more votes from the suburbs, or maybe, basically can keep you even in the suburbs. But if you don't make accommodations on policy, then you're going to keep having this erosion. And I think part of their challenge is the more identity politics they do, the more it alienates not just non-college whites, but the more it alienates every working class voter in this country. They don't want to hear that. So this is a huge challenge they have on their hands. Look, a lot of Democrats are saying today, this is a worldwide problem, that this is an incumbency issue around the world, that post-COVID, there's this hangover, incumbent parties are paying a price. And that's true. But guess what? You also had Dobbs and Donald Trump. So you had a galvanizing issue and a massively alienating candidate who half the country loathes. So you had more to work with there than Olaf Scholz or whatever, right? So I think it's a bit of a cop-out. Yes, tough time for incumbent parties, but you also had a lot to work with. Biden waited too long. And obviously, there was no succession plan set up. He resisted for almost a month after that friggin' debate. And then he finally bails out. They have an overnight primary and they coronate her. And she's never talked to a swing voter in her life. I mean, I'm being a little unfair there, but she was a California senator, ran in a lefty primary in 2019. And then she's on the ticket during a COVID year for 3 months. And then for 3.5 years, she's basically talking to Democratic constituency groups, guys. She wasn't spending a lot of time in La Crosse, Wisconsin in her career, Anyways.
So do you think,
is that an answer or a rant? Maybe
it's both. And
yeah, there you go.
So you're saying that this election was as much a referendum on the rhetoric and positioning of the Democratic Party as it was some kind of restoration for Trump. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm gonna, which is maybe this tone sometimes that the Democratic Party has been known for, this sort of tone of moral superiority, maybe does not play well among the broadest swath of populist voters.
Yeah, look, every 2 years, the numbers don't lie. They have a class issue and they have a gender issue. There is a partisan realignment taking place in this country in which working class voters are more and more receptive to Trump and the kind of his version of populism. And you don't respond to that. I mean, look, Biden was warned. I wrote a book with a colleague that came out, which you guys can get on Amazon.com if you want. It's still available.
I have a copy. It's marvelous.
Thank you. 2021, Biden's pollster, a guy named Johnny Anzalone, who, by the way, was not the pollster for his reelection, but his pollster in 2020. And for years before that, you have a problem on immigration and inflation. He's warning Biden and the West Wing, 2021, immigration and inflation, the blinking lights. And Biden's got majorities in both chambers. He wants to be FDR. He ain't thinking about inflation and immigration. He's thinking about building a big legacy. And then what happens? Well, guess what? They took all the wrong lessons from the midterms. And Biden says, whoa, unlike Clinton and Obama, I had a great midterm. There was no red wave. Those guys got slaughtered in their midterms. Why should I have to get out? Why should I have to quit my reelection when I had a great midterm and my message about Trump and norms and the MAGA Republicans is breaking through? And my God, that's the original sin, because there's no pressure on Biden. in the 3 months after the midterms of 2022 to get out of the race. And the party just says, maybe Joe's got it. Maybe Joe knows something that we don't know. Maybe we shouldn't pressure him. And they go silent, and there's not one person in the party, not one sitting governor or senator who says, Mr. President, it's time to call it a career. You can't run for re-election at age 82. The only guy who was mocked was a congressman from Minnesota named Dean Phillips, who begged other folks to challenge Biden in 2023. They all said no. He did it himself and obviously got destroyed because there was just no appetite to ever challenge Biden. Because A, they didn't want to challenge Biden because that would be helping Trump, which is the cardinal sin. You can't criticize our guy. You help the bad guy if you do that. And B, they didn't want to answer the next question, guys, which was, okay, if not Biden, who's the nominee? Because they sure as heck would have said, well, it ain't Kamala Harris. And they didn't want to say that. So instead, we'll just keep quiet and hope we can push Joe out for one more time at 82. And that was the plan. And guess what? It wasn't going to happen. And in desperate measure, they called for early debate because they were getting beaten and they had to change the narrative. And they put the ball in the air and said, let's do a June debate. And it turned out to be the worst bet in modern American political history.
Well, it's hard to disagree with much of that narrative, Jonathan, but I tell you what, I want to bring Liam back into this. And I also want to direct us a little bit because I know a little something about the people that are tuned in to this webinar. And that is that many of them are interested in energy related issues. So my ham-fisted way of getting that in, you mentioned the two issues that Anzalone talked about were inflation and immigration. We'll leave immigration for another day, but with respect to inflation, energy prices is certainly one benchmark that's very present in people's lives. They get a bill every month regarding it. They pass signage as they drive along and see what the price of another energy commodity is. So it's very present in their lives. What role do you think specifically, and I'm going to go to Liam first, what role do you think energy-related issues, you could expand that to include climate change if you wish, but what role do you think those played in the result we saw last night? I mean, after all, the primary energy statute that's been passed is called Inflation Reduction Act. So at least it's supposed to be framed around the issue of reducing energy prices, admittedly in the longer term. Okay, don't have a heart attack, Jonathan. Let me ask Liam.
No, I'm working on 3 hours sleep, man. It's not you, it's me.
Me too. Okay, Liam first, then Jonathan.
Quietly played a very important role in the sense that I think it was embedded in the dynamics that Jonathan mentioned, the class divide. Energy was messaged by Republicans as your gas is costing more, your cost of living is above where it had been before. And then I think there was a recognition on the Democratic side that the danger of sort of putting climate front and center, climate per se, and you ended up with this weird, untenable business where Harris is on the stage in Pennsylvania talking about how she's not going to ban fracking. So it put them on the defensive, whereas Republicans were able to play offense. And because of the values of their respective parties, it was just an uncomfortable topic to touch for Democrats.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let's switch to a lightning round because we've got to be pretty much out of time for the segment. So quick lightning round, and we'll focus on Congress for a minute here. So the Senate obviously has changed. I mean, there's no debate here. The Senate has changed leadership. Number one, what were big surprises from last night? And number two, who will the Republicans choose as their Senate Majority Leader? Go. Let's go, Liam, and then Jonathan.
I want to know what Jonathan has to say. Jonathan.
Okay, let's go Jonathan. Let's go Jonathan and then Liam.
Well, I thought for some time that Thune has an advantage and is the likely next Senate leader. I don't know if that necessarily changes in light of last night. I'm not sure why anything last night would change that, but maybe Liam feels different. As a Cornyn guy.
Liam, why don't you take the Cornyn side of the ledger here?
I think it's a question of casting, right? It's the same as ever. Donald Trump is going to wake up in the morning, decide who he sees in the in his sort of auditioning stage as who's the right guy. And the tall tan man, from South Dakota seems like a good pick. But at the same time, if you think about his relationship with John Cornyn has been solid throughout. He nearly picked him as the FBI director. So he thinks of John Cornyn in a different respect as being straight out of central casting. I think those are critical. And at the end of the day, as important as Trump is, he will be the elephant in the room. J.D. Vance will in fact be in the room, but this is a private ballot, so anything can happen when the question is raised.
Well, one thing we know for sure is that John Barrasso is running for the Senate whip, but not for the majority leader position, which has a clean pathway open for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to be chaired by Mike Lee from Utah. I think that's right. There are other people who have been interested in it, but that pathway seems pretty clear to me. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that. And Lee is a small government kind of guy. He's a constitutionalist. He is not a what I would call policy empire builder. And so my anticipation is an ENR committee, which is perhaps not as grand. On the other hand, an ENR committee, which will have to pick up again the cudgel of permitting reform, because I think we can all agree that the lame duck is going to be pretty damn lame given the significance of the win by the Republicans. And on Senate EPW, it's never been in doubt. Shelley Moore Capito has been a very active ranking member of that committee for some time. She's articulated many positions. She has been a very active legislator, and we're going to see her as I suspect, a very active chair. Of course, we don't know what is up for the House, right? I saw one report, Liam, I think, that said that the House could end up with 218 votes for the Republicans. And as my handy dandy calculator tells me, that's the minimum number required. The House under Republican control has been fractious for some time. I can't imagine it within a narrower margin being any more pleasant to deal with. But I do want to give you guys the last word, and then we'll switch it over. I will throw it back to Dee and Nikki Budzinski. House, and that's a good segue, isn't it? Because Nikki's a member of the House.
There you go.
So there you go, right? So what about the House? Governable, and do we think, when will we know what the leadership of the House really is? And if it's 218, I mean, what does that mean practically? So.
I mean, we got to wait for California, which always takes a few days, if not a week. So I think California will tell us. I think they may have a blue mirage. I think some of these longer counts are gonna find more votes for Republicans. Places like Arizona, where Democrats were kind of teetering. Where Republican incumbents were kind of teetering last night. I think it's possible that that as the count goes on, you can find more Republican votes. So I think it's possible that the Republicans could still hang on, but also totally possible that you could have a narrow Democratic majority. And then there's massive pressure on Hakeem Jeffries, right? Here's somebody who's going to have what is a left of center caucus, and he's from Blue America, right? Donald Trump pardons himself or drops all these investigations and commits these acts. I mean, what does Jeffries do? Is he going to confront Trump from day one on that stuff, bring up impeachment articles? I can tell you this. The survivors who narrowly won their reelection, who are from centrist districts, aren't going to want to do that. They're going to want to have Jeffries try to work with Trump. It's going to be a really tough situation for him if he does pull this thing out, because if he is speaker, it's going to be with 2 votes.
He's a pretty talented politician, in my judgment, with a pretty good relationship with Mike Johnson, who, by the way, for those who stayed up to 2:45 in the morning, the president name-checked Mike Johnson, calling him a great speaker. So I don't know what that signals. And Johnson was on hand last night, so that was kind of interesting. Texans, many of you are out there in the audience. I'd be remiss if I didn't say Brian Babin has expressed interest in taking over for Frank Lucas at the House Science Committee, which has an interesting and sometimes elastic jurisdiction. House budget still going to be under control of our great and good friend Jody Arrington, so that would seem to proceed as well. In foreign affairs, Mike McCall is seeking a waiver, but waivers are tough, even particularly in very narrow margin leadership races. And Mike Burgess, I guess, continues as Rules Committee chair. So Texans, once again, have a lot of favored positions that will make it a very relevant delegation to Congress. So for those of you out there calling in from Texas, not a terrible night for those members at least. Liam, do you want to have the last word?
I just think, what I want, I think Jonathan's report has reflected this. The fascinating thing is going to be the shift of the morning after of Republicans trying to figure out what it means to be in a world where this is Donald Trump's party. This is Donald Trump's Senate. It's no longer Mitch McConnell's Senate. It's no longer, he's the captain now. And it's not by a fluke as it was in 2016. And it's not, by the skin of his teeth like it was in 2020. People affirmatively voted as a popular matter and as an electoral matter for Donald Trump. And he has relatively speaking, has a mandate we haven't seen in some time and has political capital. And the question is how he spends it and how he marshals the votes for that on Capitol Hill.
Jonathan, you have anything you want to say?
No, look, I think Democrats are going to have a lot of soul searching to do. And I think the instinct by some of them will be, well, Trump will overreach and we'll benefit from that. And we'll just sort of ride the backlash to Trump's excesses. And that's the way most parties come back, is the pendulum swings when the other guys go too far. Here's a word of warning on that, though, for Democrats. If you do that and you sort of jump on Trump's perceived excesses, do you just, douse more kerosene on the fire and make your class and your gender problems worse politically? That is their challenge. How can Democrats be loyal to their key constituencies, but also accommodate a profound challenge when it comes to men and working class voters in this country who they're not reaching, in part on culture and in part because of economic issues? And more identity politics is not going to help the cause. But that's going to be the temptation if Trump really does go far, especially when it comes to deportation. How do Democrats balance that? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Jonathan, that is a perfect segue. Thank you both. But now,
thanks, Scott. Sorry to be late. Thanks, Liam.
Oh, no problem. Now we have the perfect foil to answer some of those questions that Jonathan Martin raised, or to react to them at least, because my good and great colleague Dee Martin is going to interview one of the most talented young members in the House of Representatives for the Democratic Party, Nikki Budzinski from Illinois, who has close relationships with the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so she'll be in a good position to perhaps react to some of that or to say whatever else she wants. So I'm going to turn it to you, Dee, and Nikki. Hey, Nikki.
Thank you,
Hi,
Scott.
Scott. Thank you.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is great to see you, and congratulations to you on a successful night. Look, it was obviously not the night overall that the party might have hoped for, but you personally outperformed your results in 7 of your counties in 2022 and flipped a red county and won by 15. What do you think your voters saw that made the difference there?
Well, thank you, Dee. Thank you for having me this morning. Obviously, we're all, it's a sobering morning for us as Democrats, or speaking for myself, and just taking some time to reflect on our race and lessons learned. I'm really proud of my team and the work that we've done to kind of improve on our 2022 numbers, especially given the environment from last night. I think what I would really attribute it to is something I often say to my constituents, which is send me to Washington to be the workhorse, not the show horse. Send me to Washington to not be a part of the political noise, but a part of the solution. Send me to Washington to deliver for you. And those were the issues that I was really focused on. And I was very clear with constituents that I was going to work with anyone that would help me accomplish that. So a number, I'm proud of my bipartisanship score. I'm proud of the number of pieces of legislation I've been able to really develop real relationships on the other side of the aisle to really lead on, whether it's, the Affordable Connectivity Program, workforce development, a number of agricultural or veterans issues, but really staying focused, I think, in the district on results and showing up and delivering on those results, I think, is what I would attribute our results to last night.
Well, congratulations again on that. And I want to pick up on the theme of bipartisanship. You and I have spoken many times on the hard work that you put into bipartisanship. And I think one of those issue areas is in the area of energy, particularly energy infrastructure. And you've done a tremendous job of working with Republicans and obviously with Democrats on some of those energy issues. So let's talk about that a little bit. There are a lot of major energy infrastructure projects underway right now in the United States.
Yeah.
And during this upcoming presidential transition, what can the private sector, union workers, you are a leader of the labor movement, you did that work organizing before you came to office, and investors, what can they expect to happen to the momentum on these projects? Because we're really in a period of investment and momentum. Many of these are at critical junctures in terms of moving forward. What do you think we can expect during the transition?
Yeah, well, I would just say first up, my approach to energy has been an all of the above approach, which is, in order to get to, which I want to get us to full decarbonization and a clean energy economy, it's a recognition that that is going to take time. I think sometimes on our side of the aisle, when we're talking about energy policy, we talk about things as if they will happen tomorrow. But what I've come to understand, especially representing a lot of old coal communities in my district, coal mining towns that built those communities, seeing that transition up close and personal has been very informative and does inform how I look at energy issues in Washington. I think what comes top of mind to me, Dee, is permitting reform. I think we want to be building more. We want to be building faster. We need to be building in all of the above in order to meet our energy needs. And decarbonization and transitioning to a clean energy economy is an important component to how we're looking at that path forward. That's the way I look at it. But I do think that permitting reform is something that has had bipartisan support. I do think in this next Congress should really be a main focus, and I think could be something that we could really truly get accomplished.
I think you're exactly right on that. We've already seen some momentum, and I think whatever the composition of the next Congress is, permitting reform will be a top priority in both chambers and for both parties, and we look forward to that. I want to turn to your work. Look, you are a visionary leader and a champion on biofuels.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a critically important part of representing Illinois 13, but also a critical part of the energy transition. In this political environment, we are all sort of anxiously awaiting all of the tax guidelines and tax rules that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. Yeah. What about 45Z? You have worked on this a lot. This is the Clean Fuels Production Credit. What do you think we can expect in this new, are we going to get this at the end of the year? What are we going to see in a new administration?
Yeah, well, what I would say, this is again another bipartisan issue. I've led letters to the administration adding, my voice to urgency to getting 45Z out. I've met with my growers who the uncertainty is what is killing us. And we need that guidance sooner rather than later. I was really privileged to have John Podesta come to my district to meet with some of our agriculture stakeholders firsthand to hear a lot of their concerns around the delay on the release of 45Z guidance. What I'm hoping to see in this next Congress are things like decoupling out of that guidance. I think continuing to maintain conservation practices as a priority in the build out of a sustainable aviation fuel market is something I'd like to see. We'll see in this next Congress how others share that priority, but I would voice that as a priority. But one of the things I think we learned from 40B is that how stringent and restrictive the guidance was around coupling all of these different conservation practices. It really stalled, I think, the ability for us to unleash this new market and really provide the stability to the growers that's needed. So I'm hoping that perhaps the Biden administration, as it is transitioning out, will release 45Z guidance. Sooner we had heard, some indications from the Secretary of Agriculture, the date of January 20th. I don't know how arbitrary or, accurate that date is and how the election results of last night might or might not change that. But if this administration can't get out that guidance, I would hope that the next could, because I am a very big believer in biofuels. And again, this is a win-win throughout the Midwest, where we grow so much corn and soybean. This is a brand new market. That's the thing I hear from my farmers first and foremost. They want new markets. This is the perfect example of that. I'd also add that, things like year-round E15, there are a lot of, I think, low-hanging fruit wins in the biofuel space that would be ripe for the next administration to act on quickly, or hopefully the Biden administration could still move quickly on before they depart.
Thank you for that. And I want to pivot to another one of the issues that you hold near and dear to your heart. I referenced it earlier, and that is you as a labor leader. You have worked with unions and workers, and you are always an advocate for workers. So given that deep policy background and experience, how might the new Congress and administration impact the balance among union interests, employer practices, and economic growth? Obviously, unions were built into the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and there are a lot of incentives for unionized labor. How do you see that changing?
Mm-hmm. I think there is a lot of deep soul searching that we need to be doing as a party, I would say, to the Democrats, as it relates to connecting with working class people and working class issues. I think that was one of the clearest message I personally heard last night, is that we as a party are not connecting on those issues. And so while I'm someone who very much believes in the fact that the labor movement is what built this middle class in our country, I think that the labor movement, along with the Democratic Party, has a lot of work to connect with those folks and their issues that they are really trying to work through at the kitchen table. The economic vision that I think the vice president was trying to put forward is just not the economic reality of what working people feel in their daily lives. And so this next administration and this next Congress, I would hope, will focus on things that I've been focusing on, which is helping, working people, keeping more of what they earn. How are we putting money back in their pocketbooks? One of the issues that I've started to really lean in on is looking at PBMs in particular as the middlemen that we're seeing the FTC say really clearly who are driving up the cost of prescription drugs in this country. I think those are the types of issues that have bipartisan support. I'm a member of the Bipartisan Rural Health Caucus, and Representative Harshbarger is on, along with Representative Auchincloss, this Pharmacists Fight Back Act, which takes on the PBMs. I think it's finding those kind of economic issues that help support working people, help them keep more of what they earn, that are truly bipartisan, that I think will resonate most with working people. And I use the PBMs as just one of those examples. I'm also leading on a bill to kind of re-jumpstart the Affordable Connectivity Program with my friend Representative Mike Carey in Ohio. We've been doing some other work with Representative Kiggins on that bill too. That helps make sure that families can afford high-speed internet access in this country. Actually, Senator Vance is the sponsor of it in the Senate. Those are the kind of mixtures, I think, of issues that support working people and their economic concerns that we need to be focused on in the next Congress. And that's the best way to, I think, to connect again with those voters.
And so that's from a subject matter perspective, but also let's talk for a second about process. What is the art of the possible in a new Congress? You've had a front row seat in the House. If the House is in the lead in the next Congress, and if it's in the lead by a very narrow margin, do you think the House is governable?
I think that is to be determined, Dee, honestly. I mean, the first 2 years that I had in the House was very frustrating, and a definite significant portions of time did feel ungoverned by the leadership that we had in that time. I think that I have always believed that if we were to take the House, and that path is still possible this morning, but it does seem like a narrow path, that it was going to be by a very narrow majority. If the Republicans keep it, it will be by a narrow majority on their side. And so the work that we do across the aisle with each other is invaluable. And it is, I will always believe, at least through this next Congress, the path forward on the issues and making the art of the possible possible. It's only going to be by working together on the issues where we can find common ground, leaving the rest of it on the cutting room floor, and just focusing on the areas where we can work together. And that's going to be my challenge as I look at my second term, is what are those issues? I think as a team, we've identified a few of them. I've highlighted them: biofuels, affordable connectivity, PBM reform. You know, those are issues where I think we'll be able to kind of continue to work together. But the leadership and what that looks like, I think, is still very much to be determined.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for being here this morning. I know you have a busy day. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
And thank you for your commitment to bipartisanship, and we look forward to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. Thank you. Take care.
Over to you, Scott.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dee. And again, thanks also to Nikki for appearing with us. Okay. I have a great honor of introducing somebody who perhaps comes from a slightly different political orientation than Congresswoman Budzinski, and that's the former Deputy Secretary of Energy in the last Trump administration, Mark Menzies, who's also the president and CEO of the U.S. Energy Association, as he is demonstrating behind him. And USEA is one of the oldest, frankly, organizations, nonpartisan organizations that deals with energy policy development and sharing of information here in Washington. Mark, you and I have known each other for north of 2 decades, I think, at this point.
Yeah, we don't have to confess too loudly, but yes.
That's right. That's right. But I do want to say, I mean, were you surprised by last night? What do you think? What's the takeaway? Were you surprised? And what's the takeaway people should take away, particularly on the nexus point between energy policy development and what happened last night in the election?
Well, let me first say, Scott, thank you very much, for having me on your award-winning webinar. It's quite impressive. So I'm honored to be part of it. I have to also say, I was so entertained by the previous speakers. As I had mentioned, I hope that I can keep up the enthusiasm and insights so that your listeners are not and viewers are not disappointed. And let me also just say that my words today are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of the United States Energy Association, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Trump campaign. So was I surprised? Of course. Surprised to see the precision at which one could monitor how the candidates were either overperforming or underperforming in real time, whether you were watching, the network news or cable shows. The development of technologies, I think, to share information in real time was quite compelling. And so the reason we're in the fog this morning is we all stayed up to watch, all of that unfold. And then to see where the gains were made, I think, too, was sort of surprising when you look at where some of the gains were made by President Trump. The biggest feeling I probably felt was relief that the election was declared final. Certainly before the election, most of my colleagues and informed people, would tell their members or to tell, their families, just be patient. Just settle down. This may take a while. And to be sure, we're still looking at the House outcome, but the finality of it was as much a relief, I think, was sort of the biggest feeling, one way or the other, that it's sort of behind us, if you will, and so we can all look, forward. So I think that's that's my reaction to that.
Wise reactions indeed. They say, Mark, that personnel is policy. And I don't think anyone who is carrying a short list of potential energy personnel for the next administration around doesn't have at least somewhere on that list the name of Mark Menzies. So do you have any big announcements you'd like to make today?
No announcements. No announcements. But I would
Okay.
like to share an insight on the
Okay.
leaders of the Department of Energy. And I'm sure your listeners and viewers are aware of this, but I think it's worth sort of, repeating. So, you know what has been written about probably the most likely potential Secretary of Energy is now will be former governor Doug Burgum, right, of North Dakota. Well, and there are many reasons why. Obviously, North Dakota is an oil and gas producing state, et cetera. But the trend has been of late. If you can go back to President Trump's first term, when he appointed former Governor Rick Perry from Texas, right, to serve. He thought that a former governor, would be good at directing the Department of Energy for reasons that became apparent in the role that Governor Perry played as secretary. And then you saw President Biden appoint former Governor Jennifer Granholm, another former governor, right? So you get a lot of skill sets when you bring a former governor in to head an agency. And so now if you're sort of looking at that as a trend of success, I think, because I think by all measures, former governors have demonstrated a fairly good ability, to run federal agencies because of their executive branch abilities developed, at the governorship level. So, Governor Burgum would likewise probably bring those same skill sets. So that's what I would like to point out to your listeners and viewers.
Yeah, I actually think he distinguished himself on the stage as he sought the presidency in his own right. He clearly showed himself to be an expert on policy matters, and that perhaps wasn't exactly what the public was buying at that time, but it nonetheless he introduced himself well to the American public. So
I just wanted to clarify: it's not that you have to be a former governor to be an effective secretary. Secretary Bruyette was not a former governor, but I think by all measures he likewise ran that department as well as Secretary Perry.
So we may deduce from this then you either have to be a former governor or you have to be a Louisianian.
Well, I'm always for that trend wherever it may be.
That's right. Okay. While we're on the topic of the Department of Energy, obviously we got a lot of folks that are interested in DOE, particularly as DOE has played an outsized role in implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and in bipartisan infrastructure and in other areas. Looking back on your experience dealing with DOE transitions in a Trump administration, how do career staff and political appointees typically manage the handoff of major energy initiatives between administrations? And I think that's particularly relevant at a time when IRA is implemented but not fully implemented, and also not likely, candidly, to be repealed. So it still has some forward momentum. So how does DOE handle transitions like that?
Well, thanks for the question. It's as much a process that has been established, over administrations, via administrations. And so careers typically, not only at the department, but all agencies sort of have a pretty set process. And so what has happened is that briefing books, probably electronic briefing books today, if you will, that describe all programs, all offices within the agency. So that's an enormous undertaking. It describes the offices, what their mission is, the statutory basis, the appropriations, the expenditures, the amount of obligated funds, that are all part of these programs. It's not just limited to initiatives. All right. Now, and then and let me just say one more word. Now, that Department of Energy really has changed significantly since the last administration, right? Because after the passage of IIJA and IRA, as you said, the department size has doubled essentially. And now, so there are new offices that did not exist in the past. So to be sure, the transition team will, get briefed on what does it look like today? Why does it look like what it looks like? And then to have all that other information I just described. And then what also goes on, of course, is a list. You create a list of all the regulations, all the orders, all the presidential memos, all the secretarial memos, everything that has been issued during the term and categorized by subject matter and then import. And so, during the transition, you learn, if you're not aware of it, what has happened, you have that list created and the reasons why. And you'll see some orders, that may be supported by White House memos or presidential directives, so you try to look for statutory authority and then, what's the policy goal and why. And so all of that, it's as much as it's really housekeeping. And so you have these huge lists that you have to go through. And that's what goes on during the transition. And those briefing books, if I can still use that term, also serve as the purpose to brief the potential political appointees that would go through confirmation hearings, that would have to, try to explain what the agency is up to, and whether or not these programs would likely be continued or not.
Mark, let me ask you one last question, which is, a lot of the action, particularly in the sort of renewable or clean energy transition space, if we take it as a granted that those will not be as high a priority issues as perhaps they were in the current administration, in the next administration, a lot of the action is probably going to shift toward the states and localities, but particularly states, many of whom have actually adopted clean electricity standards and renewable portfolio standards, depending on when they took action. How does a DOE handle its relationship, the interplay essentially between federal and state action?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. I mean, DOE, of course, there's a, in the DOE ORG Act is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for example. And so, the FERC has certain jurisdiction under the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act, and that typically is wholesale and it's typical interstate issues. And then typically, DOE also has good relationships with NARUC, the National Association of Utility Commissioners, because so much of energy policy is done at the state level and the municipal level. And so there's not a formal relationship, but there's always efforts to be made so that you're fully informed at the state level of what's going on. As you know, there is no national real energy mandate that, whether you have a national transmission grid, which we don't have, that typically is done, at the state level. There's no federal eminent domain authority for interstate transmission systems. And, we don't have a national renewable energy portfolio standard, for example. So that's all done by the states. And so that is how it has been developing for really decades. So really, there's nothing new there. I mean, with respect to different, policies, one hallmark of the first Trump administration was to not pick winners and losers on technologies or type of energy. A lot of effort went back then to ensure that nuclear could be treated equally with other sources of energy, for example, that, there was renewables weren't forced on a particular group if they didn't want to have renewable power, for example. So those restrictions were lifted. And typically, the hallmark I would expect of this incoming Trump administration was, again, look for where restrictions exist that do not allow choice by those that need the energy and need affordable energy and desire energy to make choices that fit the local community, and typically within that state or local community. And that's the hallmark that you're going to see. It's not going to be one way, or no way. And so that's how the policy analysis is going to go.
Mark, do you think, and this really is the takeout question, do you think that orientation back to sort of tech neutrality that you're talking about, do you think that'll be reflected, for example, in changes in the loan guarantee office at, he says, leading the witness?
Well, yeah, as long as you have statutory authority to do those kinds of things, because you have to look at the appropriations and to see, if there's any limitation on appropriation language. But yes, typically, it's going to be those restrictions would be lifted. There'll be opportunities for all kinds of different technologies can come about. And remember, our technological world is changing very rapidly, Scott, as you know. I mean, whether it's in the nuclear space, whether it's SMRs, or now we're even talking about fusion. People are actually trying to put policies in place for potential fusion, et cetera. And we still have, wind and solar technologies, that we're developing. I mean, photovoltaics may be replaced by some new technology, the liquid crystalline perovskites, for example. That's always a promising new technology. And so, yeah, it's basically technology neutral. And the loan program office, though, likewise, the government role on that is to help take technological risk, right? Because typically today, there's not really a lack of capital out there for really good ideas. So we see Wall Street coming in. So if you have a chance in the capital markets, to push out a technology, it could be that the DOE could help with a technological risk to really push out, a new technology. And then that's coupled typically with the technology transfer office also at DOE. And the purpose is really to push potentially breakthrough technologies out, into the marketplace.
I think you'd have a lot of agreement from some of the folks that are currently there on those issues. Mark, thank you so much for making time for us. I know it's a busy day for you, like it is for the rest of us. And thanks much. Please, stay on listening in if the spirit moves you. But
right,
but
thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm throwing to myself now and going to take a few quick minutes for just what I consider to be some quick takeaways on energy and environmental issues that I think we can deduce from last night. The first is, I think that the next Trump administration, is going to continue a rather aggressive approach to fossil fuel expansion. I mean, the funniest comment made by President Trump last night was when he turned to Bobby Kennedy and he said, and I'm quoting now, "Stay away from the liquid gold, Bobby." So a notion that fine if Kennedy wants to work on healthcare issues, but don't to thine own self be true, working on environmental issues as it relates to oil and gas development. And what that really means is probably an anticipation of an immediate spate of executive orders to expedite drilling permits on federal lands, an attempt to fast track pipeline approvals, including previously rejected projects, perhaps, expanding offshore drilling programs. And of course, now that Ted Cruz has been reelected, and he will be the chairman of the Commerce Committee, which will have jurisdiction over those offshore drilling programs. So you could see some connectivity there between the administration and the Cruz team, and reduced environmental reviews, which can have impacts even for independent agencies like the FERC, provided that guardrails established by the DC Circuit don't interfere with that. Second, I think the Paris Agreement on global climate change is going to continue to be under fire. It might be even broader in this case. It might include an attempt to force withdrawal from the underlying UN Framework Convention. But that has serious issues for U.S. leadership in the climate space, and it may raise important constitutional and legal issues about dropping out of a treaty and what that requires in terms of Senate confirmation, or rather ratification. But with a Senate in control by several seats, if we believe the results of last night, then that may be doable. IRA implementation will continue to be devil. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But cleaning up some of the lack of clarity on some ends, hydrogen comes to mind, carbon capture and sequestration comes to mind, and in the alternative, in the case of sort of electric vehicles and the like, maybe a de-emphasis on certain technologies. But as Speaker Johnson famously said, more of a scalpel than a sledgehammer. I think, depending on how you view the role that Elon Musk played last night, a reversal of electric vehicle policy is likely, including rescinding EPA vehicle emission standards, all of which are being challenged in court as we speak, challenging California's special authority under the Clean Air Act, changing federal procurement rules, modifying CAFE standards. All of these are ways to right-size the regulatory footprint that has been pushing out electric vehicles over internal combustion engines. And then as a general proposition, just more effective deregulation. And the reason I use the word effective is because last time around, and none better than my colleague Jeff Homestead here at Bracewell to talk to this issue, but last time around, there was the Trump administration had a full head of steam trying to do deregulation and didn't always cross every T and dot every I on administrative laws and constraints. I think they're not going to make that same mistake again. And as a result, attempts to deregulate can be a lot more effective. There's also a lot of major regulations. The Section 111 Clean Power Plan comes to mind that are already subject to litigation for which the administration could settle on favorable terms. And we see that over and over again. There are other alternatives in mind too, like the use of the Congressional Review Act. But one of the great living experts on CRA, Joe Brazauskas, is going to talk to us a little bit later, and we'll bring up that question with him. And then, as Mark said, personnel is policy. And so we'll see some familiar faces proceeding, perhaps. Again, this is all speculation, and some perhaps less familiar faces or new faces, like a Doug Burgum. Familiar faces, perhaps like our old friend Andrew Wheeler, might be an interesting fit back at EPA and other places like it. So, all in all, I would be wrong if I didn't say it is an interesting time. I did mention that I think a full-scale repeal of the IRA is not likely. Obviously, with control of both houses, and our most recent data says Republican control of the House of Representatives could be between 218 and 220, still almost ungovernable. But then the question would be, of what use could budget reconciliation be used in order to make alterations, some alterations, but again, not alterations for every technology, because I do think, as Mark Menz has suggested, there is support for a broad range of technologies in a next administration. So, all right, that is my just few notes on what's going on about key takeaways for energy and environment from last night. Let's turn now to my colleague Frank Maisano, and I believe he is going to have special guest star Ben Starro from E&E, the E&E News Division. I don't know how they style it these days, of Politico, who has been a fabulous reporter on clean energy transition issues. Hey, Ben. All right, so let me turn it to Frank to ask a few questions of a member of the working press, Ben Starro.
Great, Scott. Thanks for having me. And Ben, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you jumping in, knowing what's you probably wrote 3 or 4 different stories, depending on what the results of the election were going to be. But you did have a story this morning that said the Trump victory was a gut punch for U.S. climate action. So what is the story going to be for climate change and energy transition as we move into this second Trump administration as you see it?
Well, I can tell you that, I guess I have to say, first of all, to answer Scott's question, I think we are officially Politico's E&E News is how we are referred to now.
Oops.
All good. So I think, look, I think the way I would answer that question is what I'm thinking about today. And what I'm thinking about today is, how do Republicans interpret the mandate that they won last night? And what I mean by that is, in the run up to the election, when you talk to industry folks, when you talk to people on Wall Street, there's this widespread expectation that the IRA will live on in some form. But I think the thing that I'm wondering about today is, how far is Trump going to go? I mean, well, the results of the presidential election aren't necessarily surprising. I think the Senate and the decisive margins there are surprising. And so the question is, how do Republicans interpret that? And are there parts of the IRA that they want to keep? Are there parts of the IRA they don't want to keep? I think that there's contrasting views on that, and so that's the sort of the main thing that I'm wondering about. There's a lot of other things we could chat about too, but that's
let's
the big
talk
question.
Let's talk about the IRA a little bit, because we've argued, I at least have argued with you, that there's substantial Republican support for provisions of the IRA when you look at carbon capture and hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. So a wholesale overthrow is probably not likely. What do you make of this seemingly substantial Republican support for the IRA, given that Joe Manchin was really the one who negotiated it, and he tends to like the types of energy policy that Republicans have supported over the years?
Well, the thing that's so interesting is, just first to say, there was this famous letter that probably a lot of people are aware of that 18 Republican congressmen wrote saying they didn't want to see the IRA repealed. And that letter is incredible. I've talked to CEOs of companies who were willing to go forward on investments because of that, and because they were getting that signal from Republicans. Having said that, I think the question is, and one of the things that's difficult as we sit here, or at least for me today, is we haven't had a lot of conversations about the specifics, right? It's like one thing to say, I'm against the repeal of the IRA, but like, what parts of it? Are we talking about the EV subsidies? Are we talking about the, 45X for manufacturing? Are we talking about hydrogen? What are we talking about exactly? And so I think that's just where my brain has gone this morning is, where are people going to fall? And I think my expectation would be is we're going to see some sort of push and pull on both sides of the Republican Party of where they come down on some of those issues.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of those specifics. The most immediate specific in my mind is starting Monday, the UN climate change meetings begin in Baku. And of course, previously the Trump administration pulled us out of the Paris Agreement, even against the recommendations of some in the party, like a guy like Kevin Cramer. How does this play out now next week? I think that giant crash was many of the climate change participants seeing the results last night. But how does this play out in the immediate term next week and the week after with Biden negotiators over there talking about climate finance and talking about additional restrictions or policies?
Well, I really wish I knew, Frank, but I guess this is what I can say for sure is, we just got a UN emissions gap report, and it said that the world is not on track for meeting the Paris climate targets. And that was with a presidential administration that was all in on climate. And so, now with the Trump administration coming in, it seems like, it was already hard to hit those targets, and it's probably more unlikely that we won't hit those targets, but I guess I thought Scott's comment was really interesting. Again, this sort of in the big picture sense, it's like, how far is Trump going to go? Is he going to try to attack the underlying legal principle of the United States involvement in these treaties? We've seen this before. I was thinking about, 8 years ago, COP always falls right after the U.S. election, and John Kerry was in Antarctica, I think, at the time when Trump won the first time, and it hit the world as a surprise. I think it will be less of a surprise this time. I think the world will be a little more prepared for what is coming. But to pull back the curtain a little bit on the E&E staff, as we were talking about this morning, like one of the questions that we had is like, what happens with China now? Like, on the one hand, they're really world's largest coal market, big coal consumer, but on the other hand, dominating industries like electric vehicles and batteries. And, do the Europeans decide, we're going to not put up trade barriers to those things? Those are the sort of questions that we were batting around and wondering about how, how these things are going to play out in Baku next week.
Let's talk about two other specific issues, and then we'll let you get back to writing, all the stories that you have to get to. One, the big focus was on the LNG pause. Certainly there's some notion that the administration may, before they leave, end that pause. Thoughts on that, on the LNG pause, and then finally, obviously, we've talked a lot about permitting reform over the years. Where do you think that stands, and is that something that both sides can see some agreement on, given that there's no clean energy transition unless we start speeding up the process? So,
well, it's going to be really on permitting reform. I mean, the thing is, it's so funny. It's one of those things that means different things to different people, right? So the fact that Republicans have such firm control now, I guess the question is, Democrats, when you talk to Democrats about permitting reform, they're really focused on transmission, and that's where we've seen opposition to transmission, new transmission coming into Republican states in the Southeast, for instance. So, it probably gets done, but it probably, the Democrats have less leverage now in those negotiations, right? On LNG, I mean, it seems like that is what you would expect. If the pause is still in place when Trump takes office, you would expect that could be like a day one type order, to stop that. And more importantly, perhaps, on LNG and on grid interconnection and cost allocation is who is he going to appoint to FERC? Like, those are huge, like, these are sort of the nuts and bolts. It's not like big, sexy political headlines, but like, who's on FERC and who decides these issues is going to be hugely important in terms of how all of this plays out.
Well, I want to thank you for taking some time out of your busy morning and your late night last night, because I know we were talking all day yesterday and into the evening with some of your colleagues. But thanks again for joining us and sharing your insights of you and your colleagues and what you may be covering going forward.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me, Frank.
Thanks. I'm going to throw it back to you, Scott, and take it from here.
All right. Thanks. And thanks to Ben also. That's great. Okay. Well, we've got a few. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to warn you right now, it looks like we'll probably go a little bit over at the end, but that's okay, because there's so much to talk about. I want to bring to the fore my colleague, Tim Urban, who is one of the deans of energy tax lobbyists here in Washington, and heads up our energy tax policy work that we do out of our DC office. Tim, so much to talk about, so much tax things happening. First of all, you and I and others at Bracewell have been telling folks the U.S. is at a historic crossroads on clean energy and energy tax policy. So the nexus between clean energy policy development and clean energy tax policy. Remind me again, what do we mean by that?
Thanks, Scott, and good morning. I guess before the IRA, taxpayers were pretty comfortable with a set calendar of tax incentives that periodically expire. These were the so-called technology-specific credits. And it became sort of a comfortable tempo of repetitive extensions, and that was that. Then with the IRA, of course, those legacy credits were scheduled to expire in favor of technology-neutral performance-based credits, which were a very, very ambitious agenda led by Senator Ron Wyden, the chairman of the Finance Committee, and that the implementation of those credits is not even complete, and yet now we may have a changing of the guard in the administration. We certainly are going to have some different dynamics in the Congress, although we still don't know whether indeed the president will have both a House and a Senate led by Republicans. So I think investors stand the risk of being whipsawed to some degree in terms of not having the comfort they need to make billion-dollar investments on new clean energy facilities. Now, on top of that, there's a anticipated 2025 tax bill, which has been labeled the Taxmageddon because it may be of such a large size, several trillions of dollars being moved around. And some of that bill could either end up being IRA fixes or IRA repeals or curtailments. So there's just a lot going on. And I think, anybody in the space would be well advised to be well counseled and have expert assistance.
Lord knows that's true. Speaking of the IRA, are there some key questions that really aren't settled at this point? And do you think the change in administration alters the way those questions are settled?
Well, Scott, at the very least, it brings up a big question mark. We have various charts and PowerPoints that depict some rules being finalized, some rules having, at least proposed rules having been issued, and some IRA provisions just sort of languishing with very preliminary notices and with taxpayers wringing their hands and desperately seeking additional guidance. So IRA is clearly not yet completely implemented. At the same point, it's not clear that the Trump administration officials, the incoming transition and agency people, it's not clear they will feel impelled to go in the same direction. In some cases, and I know you're going to have another speaker on this, there may be opportunities for the Trump administration to fiddle with some of these regulations. The one point I just like to make, Scott, because this comes up constantly in client calls, is that there's a difference between the statutory law and a regulation. So you can repeal or tweak regulations without repealing an underlying law. To get rid of an underlying law like the IRA, you have to pass a new law in the Congress of the United States with all of the delay and drama that entails.
Okay. We have a new administration blowing into town. Some folks' stock is going to go up. Some folks' stock is going to go down. Incidentally, all stocks seem to be going up today. So there's been a real increase in the equities market as we speak. But who are the winners and losers? You don't have to name everybody, but who are the winners and losers that result in the tax policy world as a result of yesterday's election?
Well, without naming names, Scott, I think we can conjecture that some of the characters and groups that were the most closely tied into the administration and with the more progressive offices in Congress, like, for instance, the environmental NGOs, some of the activist academics, I find it hard to believe that they're going to have the same hyper level of access that they've had for the last 4 years. On the other hand, I think there are a number of business organizations, the Chamber, NAM, the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, people like that, and maybe nonpartisan or bipartisan think tanks. I think they may get more attention and have maybe a little more access coming up. So, and I think the elephant in the room that we should acknowledge is that the conventional energy industry has not exactly been, welcomed with open arms in some of the offices in the administration and with some of the progressive Democrat Hill offices, but they may indeed have, maybe able to get their phone calls returned more promptly in a Trump administration. So, I mean, this is typical, whenever there's a change in the electorate, which results in the change in the administrations and whatnot, you get this. One point I'd like to make, though, gratuitously, is that I've been listening to the previous speakers in the webinar and frankly learning a lot. One thing I'd like to strongly agree with is that a lot of these preliminary views we've had about whether the IRA will be repealed or not repealed, et cetera, these were all based on a different sense of politics and a different sense of mandate. I'm guessing that the Trump administration incoming people are going to be coming in with sort of, two-fisted, robust feeling of a mandate to do things that are consistent with their views. I feel like if indeed we have a trifecta, which we don't, I guess, know technically right now, if the Trump administration has a Republican speaker and a Republican majority leader in the Senate, that opens the door for a reconciliation bill. So I think our new evolving Bracewell tax policy view is that if not everything, then a lot of the Internal Revenue Code is on the table in terms of, renegotiating in the 2025 tax bill. In one conversation that Liam and I had with some Hill staff, we were talking about how some members of the Republican conference in the House or Senate had made various statements favoring the IRA or vowing to defend various, provisions, the IRA and other things. And the point that the Hill staff made, which we thought was, I think, telling, was that they said, yeah, that's true, but it was before these members are faced with, horse trading and being called in by a chairman and told, you can either have your EV tax credit or you can have $2,000 deduction for every man, woman, and child in your congressional district, or you can have a lower tax rate for the middle class or something. So, I'm still optimistic that much, if not all, of the IRA may be salvageable, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that in every case, I think that, various industrial sectors and trade associations and companies are going to need to go in to the administration and to the new powers that be on Capitol Hill and make their case. I don't think it's a question of just sitting back and letting things happen, Scott.
No doubt. Tim, thanks very much. This has been enlightening as always. And I know a lot of the questions that we've received have been about tax policy issues. Let me bring on board our colleague, Joe Brazauskas. Joe joined us from a variety of previous roles. He was an associate administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency for Congressional and Legislative Affairs, so sort of EPA's lobbyist in the past Trump administration. And Joe also was counsel on oversight issues, both on the House Science Committee and on the House Oversight and Investigations Committee. So I want you to put your congressional hat on a little bit here. Joe, congressional oversight is used as a tool. Obviously, if the Congress had been Republican and a Harris administration, but then we know the way in which it would have been utilized. But here, there's some more optionality, frankly, for congressional oversight folks. One of those items is the Congressional Review Act, where a friendly Congress can pass resolutions of disapproval and pass them along to an administration that will, in fact, sign them, which can eliminate regulations. How effective a tool do you think that'll be in this period of presidential transition?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's a really great question. And so, if we're thinking about the current projections right now, which is that we, assuming a likely GOP majority in the House, and of course the Senate majority, Republican majority, congressional oversight, I sort of see in that context with the Trump administration to be utilized more as a tool to inform legislation and appropriations, and as well as to sort of instigate some of the regulatory reforms that we'll be seeing likely in coming out of the administration, and to sort of assist in building a record for the administration to institute those reforms, both, I think, regulatory and sort of if you're thinking about restructuring of the federal agencies. And so the Congressional Review Act, as you mentioned, is an important oversight tool which allows a future Congress, so the next Congress, to actually look back at any rule that was promulgated within the last 60 legislative days and actually rescind those regulations if the motion sort of passes both the House and the Senate and then is signed into law by the president. So I think certainly precedent has shown that there is an appetite when there is a Republican trifecta to go after some of these regulations. But I will also say this: the Biden administration knew this. They utilized the CRA themselves. They saw what happened to the Obama administration. They did a pretty good job of isolating themselves and finalizing a number of key environmental and energy regulations in sort of that May timeframe. But that's all to say, there are still a number of regulations that are out there, as Tim was talking about, a number of IRA provisions that might be a ripe tool for a Congressional Review Act utilization. But also the Trump administration can go back and do its own sort of either APA or non-APA style rescinding and replacing of any of these regulations. So I think we can definitely foresee that when Congress comes back into session in January of next year, that that sort of CRA will be top of the list.
Well, it looks as though the Democrats may not retain control of the House of Representatives. May not retake the House of Representatives. But let's assume that they do, and it's possible, right? It's going to take a while to count those California seats. So let's assume they do. What optionality do they have if they control one of the houses, the House of Representatives, to use oversight techniques to try and staunch the flow of new Trump priorities, particularly in the energy and environmental field?
Yeah, great question. And I think, and Jonathan Martin did talk a little bit about, if Democrats do retake the majority in the House and Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker, there will likely be a number of members at the margins who are saying, well, that was a tough one for us. Let's try to work with this administration, particularly if it's on IRA or other key legislative priorities that they want to hold on to, and find a way to work with the administration. But I will say, I think there's a way for Democrats to sort of continue to sort of, have maybe a Speaker Jeffries take the position of, we will work with the administration and take a look at this at the current Congress now, right? Mike Johnson and even McCarthy had members clamoring to impeach Biden, and he had to sort of hold them at bay. Now, that's not all to say that, if Jamie Raskin, for example, were the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, which he certainly would be in a Democratic majority, to sort of have him be the sort of the main attack point of the Trump administration. So still sending in all those letters, document requests, holding congressional hearings, trying to slow down the administration. There's no reason to think that those kinds of activities wouldn't still happen, both out of the Oversight Committee as well as the committees of substantive jurisdiction. And last point I want to say on that is that I think where certainly folks sort of outside of government need to be thinking, if there is a Democratic majority in the House, is that there is, of course, no reason why Congress cannot try to exploit some of the nexus between private companies and Trump administration policies. They've certainly shown that they want to do that in the current Democratic-controlled Senate and as ranking members of the House Representatives. So I think
right.
that those
and as we know only
on.
too well, Joe, even folks that only have a minority position are fully capable of sending letters, and so and CCing members of the working press on those letters. So that there's more than one way to skin a cat on oversight. Okay, Joe, sure. Thanks. We could talk for a long time. We're at the 11:30 mark, but Josh Zive and Paul Nathanson, we are getting a ton of questions regarding supply chain and trade issues. We also still have north of 400 people on this call. So, gentlemen, that is my way of saying sorry, but let's go ahead. Let me throw it to you two for a quick discussion. Here's all you need to cover: tariffs, trade policy development, supply chain issues, and anything else that's related to that. Gentlemen,
no problem.
Paul, why don't you start us out?
No problem, Scott. Thanks for everybody for hanging in there. Josh and I were talking offline. We were going to roll in with some Jonathan Martin style F-bombs to make sure people are paying attention. I think, Josh, we should just start talking about trade and tariffs. So, Josh, selfishly and topic wise, I think we probably should have been the first speakers since tariffs are really the centerpiece of Donald Trump's economic policy. So let's start with this, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. What's your main takeaway from last night when it comes to international trade policy?
Yeah, Paul, you and I have been working on these issues for our clients for over 2 decades. And I think this is coming close to being a case of being careful what you ask for. For years, you and I have talked about our frustrations with trade policy issues not being talked about enough, that candidates don't centerpiece them enough, that, voters aren't being asked to consider these issues clearly enough. We got that. And as a result, in this election, there is no question that tariffs were on the ballot. and that trade policy was arguably the most important part of the Trump campaign's economic mission. And as a result, the election results last night are going to be seen as an unequivocal message on issues like tariffs. And what I think that promises is over the coming weeks and months, we are going to see a flurry of different, proposals from different Republican groups, members of Congress, in addition to the incoming administration for what they'd like to do with what is really a massively open playing field of different tools that you can use when it comes to international trade. So that's why I want to turn it back to you, Paul, which is, given what we both know over the last couple of decades of how much mischief elected representatives can get into when it comes to trade policy, what do you think we need to keep an eye on for specific types of things that might be hopping over the next few months?
Well, sure. Let's start with one that you might see relatively little change. The stress is relatively, but that's steel and aluminum tariffs. I'm only saying that because the Biden administration continued the Trump tariffs that were put in place in 2018. The only change that President Biden made was to give the EU and UK and Japan tariff rate quotas, which mean that they can export a certain amount of steel and aluminum for the EU and UK to the US before the 25% and 10% tariffs hit. So those deals need to be renewed. So there's a possibility that President Trump goes back to the tariffs on the steel and aluminum for steel and aluminum exports from those countries. But I think we need to talk about a little bit about the challenges of the tariffs, and I think the steel and aluminum tariffs are a good example. A primary purpose of a tariff is to allow the domestic industry to raise its prices. And of course, that creates inflationary pressures. As we saw when President Trump imposed the steel tariffs, the price of steel shot up. And so one of the reasons is that the U.S. doesn't make enough steel to meet domestic demand. And we're down to 3 major steel makers, and that could go down to 2 depending on what happens with U.S. steel. So, as you know, we represent manufacturers who use steel, which employs 6 million people, compared to the steel makers who employ 140,000 workers. So, when you put a tax, which is what a tariff is, on those steel imports, on steel, you are raising the price of an important input. So, let's say you make a part and 70% of your cost is steel. So you're making that part in the United States, you're paying way higher steel prices than, say, somebody in Japan, China, or Germany. Your customer, even with shipping costs and possible other tariffs, say, I could get that part for 25% less, even with all those costs, you're going to lose that business. So it's very complicated. And I think steel and aluminum, we need to keep an eye on that, because that is one of when the Trump administration was in power, that was one of their favorite levers to pull. But Josh, I think we can't talk about tariffs without talking about the main target of Trump, and then this was the main target of Biden, is China. What do you think is going to happen? Candidate Trump has said up to 60% tariffs on China. He has made all sorts of threats. So what's your take on that?
Well, going after China is one of the few truly bipartisan issues that we've had over the last few years in this town. So there was very little deviation on China trade policy between the Trump's first term as president and the Biden administration. And I don't expect there to be a tremendous amount of variation when we come to a second Trump term. And that means, more tariffs, more use of things like Section 301, the ability to put tariffs on sweeping lists of products, and more with Trump going back to what he did during first term, which is using these broad threats of tariffs as a tool to try to extract some concession. With China, that was the phase 1 trade agreement. With Mexico, it was immigration-related concessions. He's going to go back to those playbooks again. But also adding on to it, I think what you're seeing being run out by folks like Bob Lighthizer, who was his U.S. trade representative, who's out there talking about putting sweeping across the board tariffs in place to serve as a permanent trade balance solving tool. So you're going to see a mix of short-term things targeting China, long-term structural efforts, and the use of the whole range of trade laws, Section 301, the 232s, everything. But I think as we boil that all down for companies who care about these issues, what it means is that being involved in these debates early is what's important. Because while you talk about across the board tariffs, the truth is, as they're implemented, there are huge differences in slight changes in details. And by that, I mean, how many exclusions do you set out? What are the timing of those exclusions? Do you choose to create favorable conditions for certain industries? Like if you want to encourage the development of energy production and infrastructure, do you try to build in exclusions so that you make their equipment and their supplies less vulnerable to the price increases that come from tariffs? All of these present opportunities for interested parties to be involved in the creation of the tariffs, and all of those details could make a life or death differences for specific companies or industry sectors as those tariffs get implemented. At least that's what I'm thinking about from like a legislative and regulatory standpoint, Paul. How are you looking at what's coming, the storm that's coming from a public relations or communications standpoint?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Answer
Look,
that question quickly, Paul.
I have a 25-minute answer for that. So I was going to start with my, I was born in Chicago, but no, really, I think it's really important to have your voice heard. Look, supply chains are going to run through Washington, D.C. no matter what, right? So you have to make your voices heard in Washington. And I think you're right, Josh. Tariffs mean that when you say tariffs, there are a lot of different kinds of tariffs, 232s, 201s, but it's really, there's also lots of exclusions and lots of ways to minimize damage that is caused by tariffs. So you have to really have your voice heard in Washington. A couple highlights, Scott, and then I'll turn it over to you. What we need to watch for, in addition, is Trump has threatened Mexico regarding immigration policy. He did this in 2019 when he was president to raise, to put 25% tariffs on Mexico. We have the renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement coming up. So keep an eye on that. So there are a lot of issues that are coming up that is going to confront this administration. But, tariffs are here to stay, unfortunately. But, it's I guess my closing message, Scott, is that, and Josh, is that, you really need to pay attention to what's going on in Washington. And also, you need to be involved. There is a way that you could work with tariffs. I mean, that's the world that we live in, but supply chains are coming through Washington now. Thanks, Scott.
All right, guys, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry it was truncated, but though it was truncated, it was very dense. So it was a target-rich environment. And thanks very much. We did get quite a few questions about supply chain and how supply chains can be complicated by tariffs policies that are not appropriately right-sized, basically, and made flexible enough for particular cases. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on the call. This was a great time we had. We've received a lot of questions, some of which we'll respond to in writing. But I will also say that I'm going to do a really quick lightning round for some questions, particularly those that were repeated. So a 202 level question that came in is repealing the IRA or augment or taking a scalpel to the IRA will occur in the context of a budget reconciliation bill going on. And I'm going to reinterpret the question to just say, how do we make sure that budget reconciliation, which only requires simple majorities, isn't used to rob money from IRA to pay for things like corporate taxes and corporate tax reform and extension of the Trump taxes from the previous administration? And it's a good question. To a certain extent, it's a drama that we need to see play out. There will be plenty of opportunity for people to be active on that question. And I think it is important that we have seen so many Republicans understand the essential teaching of the fact that capital investments are being made in pursuit of IRA projects, and many of these capital investments are being made in so-called red states or jurisdictions, and to rip the bath mat out from under it, creates severe problems, which makes the ability to address these issues by wholesale reform to the IRA very difficult to do without being accused of increasing taxes on the flow of capital. The other thing I'd say is, apropos of the discussion you just heard with Josh and Paul, this administration believes that tariffs score appropriately so that they are fundraisers and therefore can be used to also pay for extensions of the corporate tax code. I will leave it to the high muftis of parliamentary procedure about whether or not that actually makes sense, but it is an argument that is being proffered, and certainly something that I believe the next president believes fairly strongly in. We've been asked a couple of questions about permitting reform. I mean, it's obvious that a lame duck where there's been such a significant red ripple to wave probably wants to wait for the next administration to see how far they can push it. So then the question becomes, what does a more Trump-oriented permitting bill look like? And I think that it's one that takes particular projects into consideration, like pipeline infrastructure, nuclear facilities, particularly for next generation nuclear plants, as well as for utility scale nuclear. Might it include transmission? It might, but I think a greater reluctance to expand the role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission by overly federalizing the permitting process, so achieving what is the right balance on transmission-related issues. And I think a general diminishment of next generation or knock-on effects to climate change and environmental justice as far as the interpretation of what of opportunities for conditioning permits or delaying or otherwise delaying permits. We did get a question regarding the ag bill, and all I'll say about the ag bill is that we are likely to get a patch on the ag bill to just pass program authorization on, at least during the course of the near term or lame duck, in order to make sure that programs don't run out of authorization. However, broader issues, there's still been a somewhat substantial lack of progress being made, and a divisive markup about 2 months ago, and none of those issues have really been resolved. So it will have to be an issue that is addressed in substance over the course of the next year. We were asked a question that basically said, well, you spoke to the issues of leadership in the Senate Energy Committee and the Senate Environment Committee. What about the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee of substantive jurisdiction for so many energy-related issues? And there I'll only say that if the Democrats retake control of the House, we're probably looking at Frank Pallone. He's not limited off of being the chair, so he would likely continue. The current ranking member would continue as the chair. For the Republicans, it's been perceived to be a three-way race between Bob Latta, Brett Guthrie, and Richard Hudson. I will stipulate that all those members are fine members who have lots of experience on the Energy and Commerce Committee and would make good chairmen. That said, the most recent word on the street has been that Mr. Guthrie seems to be in the lead for that role. That's an interesting question from an energy and climate perspective. Mr. Guthrie's been more associated with healthcare related issues than energy related issues. That said, in my time with him and in the time other members of our team have spent with him, he has been most open-minded about the range of jurisdiction and potential legislation that could be entertained by Energy and Commerce as it relates to energy policy development. I'm sure there are lots more questions that have come in. We'll try and answer those in writing as we can. And so now it is my happy task to thank everybody for tuning in and staying in with us as we ran a little bit over with a technical difficulty or two early, but we ran a little bit over. I hope you found the comments of the folks that we interviewed and we brought on board in our internal discussions to be thought-provoking and interesting. Obviously, this was a fabulous time for us to put this on, and a very intriguing election result as of last night, and one that we will puzzle over in coming days and months. We will be distributing written materials, and a recording of this event will be sent to registered guests and posted online. So you'll be receiving written materials. You'll be receiving additional video materials on specialty subjects, and you will be sent a recording of this broadcast for registered guests directly and posted online. So thanks, everybody. If your guys won last night, congratulations. If your guys didn't, just remember that institutions are perhaps more resilient than they look, and that we'll continue to work forward. And on a lot of the issues you are interested in, there is and will remain substantial opportunities for bipartisan discussion. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you all shortly. Bye-bye.